The dining room table was a battlefield of polished mahogany and gleaming silver, and Julian was losing. He always lost here. This was the home ground of his wife's family, a place where worth was weighed in carats and square footage, and he had long since been found wanting. His father-in-law, Richard, a man whose posture seemed permanently fixed in a state of looking down his nose, was holding forth on the recent acquisition of a rival firm. "A pittance, really," Richard declared, swirling a blood-red vintage in his glass. "Henderson practically gave it away. The man lost his nerve. In this business, nerve is everything." He glanced at Julian, a flicker of dismissal in his eyes. It was a familiar look, one that categorized Julian with the weak, the nerveless, the inconsequential. Julian offered a quiet nod, his fork tracing patterns in the sauce on his plate. He had learned that silence was his only effective armor in this house. Any word he spoke was twisted, examined for weakness, and ultimately used as evidence against him. His brother-in-law Marcus leaned forward, his cuffs flashing gold. Marcus was a developer of luxury condos, buildings that Julian privately considered to be monuments to transient greed. "It's about ambition, Dad," Marcus said, his voice slick with self-satisfaction. "Some people have it, some people, well, they're content to draft blueprints for bus shelters." The jibe, though not aimed directly by name, landed squarely on Julian. He worked for a small, boutique architectural firm that specialized in public spaces, libraries, parks, community centers. It was work that filled him with a quiet pride. But in this room, it was a source of profound shame for his wife, Clara. Clara. She sat opposite him, a portrait of strained elegance. Her smile was a masterpiece of social engineering, tight at the edges, never quite reaching her eyes. She had been quiet all evening, her gaze flitting between her father, her brother, and the man she had married. A man who, in the unforgiving light of her family's wealth, seemed to shrink with each passing moment. Julian remembered the woman he had married 10 years ago, the art history student who had been captivated by his passion, who had spent hours watching him sketch, her fingers tracing the lines on the page as if they were a map to a shared future. That woman was gone, replaced by this nervous sentinel of status. "It's a shame, really," Clara's mother Eleanor chimed in, her voice soft but laced with steel. "Julian, you were so promising at university, top of your class. Everyone said you were going to build the next great landmarks." "And so he has," Julian said, his voice even, calm. "The Northwood Community Library won the Governor's Award last year." Marcus let out a short, derisive laugh. "An award," he scoffed. "I get awards all the time. They're called 9-figure construction loans." Richard chuckled, a low rumble of approval. "Well said, son." The humiliation was a physical thing, a heat that crept up Julian's neck. He kept his expression neutral, a mask of placid indifference he had perfected over a decade of these dinners. He could feel Clara's embarrassment radiating across the table. It was a suffocating wave of disappointment. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her father, a silent apology in her eyes for her husband's spectacular failure to impress. Then came the killing blow. It was delivered by Clara, not with a shout, but with a sigh of theatrical resignation, a conversational aside to her mother that was meant for the entire table to hear. "He peaked at 25, she said. The words were quiet, almost mournful, but they cut through the clatter of cutlery with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. All that fire, all that brilliance, it just faded. He was going to set the world on fire. Now," she trailed off, a delicate shrug finishing the sentence for her. "Now he was this, an ember, a disappointment seated at her father's table." The table fell silent. Marcus smirked into his wineglass. Richard cleared his throat, a gesture of magnanimous pity. Eleanor reached over and patted Clara's hand. In that single, devastating sentence, Julian was dismissed. His past was repackaged as a brief, fleeting moment of glory. His present an endless, gentle decline into irrelevance. His entire life judged and summarized between the soup and the main course. Julian didn't react. He did not flinch. He did not argue. He slowly placed his knife and fork together on his plate, the porcelain making a faint, definitive click in the sudden quiet. He looked at Clara. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time all evening. He saw the flicker of guilt in her eyes, quickly extinguished by a familiar flame of defensiveness. She believed her words. She had mourned the brilliant man she thought she had married, and had settled for the quiet failure he had become. He thought of the object in his pocket, a single, custom-milled steel key. It was cool and heavy against his palm. He thought of the door it opened. He thought of the view from the window of the room behind that door. He thought about the man he was at 35, a man this family and his own wife had never bothered to see. A slow, cold clarity washed over him. It was not anger. It was something heavier, more final. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was the last time he would ever sit at this table. Clara thought he had peaked at 25. She had no idea what he had built at 35. But she would. They all would. And then, he would be gone. Thank you for joining us for this story. We see stories like this play out in life all the time, where people are judged on what's on the surface, not what's in their hearts or in their secret plans. If you've ever felt underestimated, I think this story will resonate with you. Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to Julian and the moment everything began to change. 10 years earlier, the world had been a canvas of infinite possibility, and Julian was the artist poised to paint a masterpiece. He met Clara in a crowded university lecture hall. He was the star of the architecture program, a prodigy whose professors spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones. His designs weren't just buildings. They were conversations between light and shadow, steel and soul. Clara, with her sharp intelligence and appreciation for beauty, saw the fire in him. She saw the future he was sketching into existence. Their courtship was a whirlwind of late-night talks in the design studio, of tracing paper dreams and whispered promises. He was drawn to her wit, her seemingly unshakable belief in him. She was, she said, in love with his mind, with the fierce passion he poured into his work. "You don't just build things, Julian," she'd told him once, her head resting on his shoulder as they looked over a sprawling model of a futuristic city. "You build hope." He believed her. He believed in the us they were building, a structure he imagined would be as strong and enduring as one of his own designs. After graduation, job offers poured in from the largest, most prestigious firms in the country. They offered staggering salaries, corner offices, and the chance to put his name on gleaming corporate towers that would scrape the sky. It was everything a young architect could dream of. But Julian had a different dream. He was mentored by a man named Arthur Vance, a brilliant but iconoclastic architect who had turned his back on corporate work decades earlier. Vance believed that architecture's true purpose was not to serve power and ego, but to serve humanity. He designed libraries that felt like cathedrals of knowledge, community centers that fostered connection, and public parks that were oases of tranquility in chaotic cities. His work didn't grace the covers of glossy business magazines, but it changed lives. When Vance offered Julian a partnership in his small, two-man firm, it was a choice between two futures. One was a path of wealth, fame, and conventional success. The other was a path of purpose, quiet impact, and modest financial reward. For Julian, it wasn't a choice at all. He chose purpose. Clara tried to be supportive. She really did. In the beginning, she celebrated his decision. "It's so noble, Julian," she'd said, though even then, a faint note of concern tinged her voice. "To use your talent for good." They married a year later. The wedding was beautiful, but Julian couldn't shake the feeling that he was an exhibit in his own life. Clara's family, the formidable dynasty of Richard and Eleanor, treated him with a kind of polite curiosity, like a strange artifact their daughter had brought home from an exotic land. They spoke of his work with a tone of bemused patronage. "How wonderful," Eleanor had said, "to be involved in such charming little projects." The first crack in their foundation appeared 2 years into the marriage. Marcus had just closed his first major deal, a gaudy residential tower that sacrificed aesthetic grace for maximum profit. He bought a monstrous house in the suburbs and a new German sports car. He brought the car to Sunday dinner, tossing the keys on the mahogany table like a trophy. "You should take it for a spin, Julian," Marcus had offered, a smirk playing on his lips. "Feel what a real engine is like." Julian, who drove a reliable 10-year-old sedan, had simply smiled and said, "No, thank you. I'm sure it's very fast." Later that night, Clara was quiet. "Don't you ever want that?" she asked, her voice small. "Want what? A car I can't drive over a speed bump?" "No," she snapped, her patience suddenly gone. "That feeling, the success, seeing something you built dominate the skyline, making a mark." "I am making a mark, Clara," he said gently. "The West End Library just opened. Kids who didn't have a safe place to read now have one." "That's different, and you know it," she said, turning away from him. "It's not the same." It was the first time she had explicitly stated the new terms of her validation. Success was no longer about hope, it was about height. It wasn't about community, it was about capital. Over the next few years, her perspective, once aligned with his, slowly drifted, pulled by the immense gravitational force of her family's values. His quiet pride in his work became, in her eyes, a lack of ambition. His choice to prioritize purpose over profit was reframed as a weakness, a failure of nerve. She started making excuses for him at family gatherings. "Julian's firm is very selective," she would say, her voice straining. "They focus on quality, not quantity." But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Her father and brother would exchange knowing glances, and the narrative was set. Julian was a man of squandered potential. The final, imperceptible shift happened about 3 years before that fateful dinner. Arthur Vance, Julian's partner and mentor, had passed away, leaving the firm, its legacy, and its future entirely in Julian's hands. To Clara, this was a chance for him to finally change course. "You could rebrand, Julian," she had urged him. "Take on some commercial clients. You could still build something significant." He had looked at her, a deep sadness in his heart. She no longer saw the significance in what he was already doing. He had inherited not just a firm, but a philosophy. He chose to honor it. He kept the firm small, taking on only 1 or 2 projects at a time, pouring all of his energy and talent into them. What Clara didn't know was that Arthur, before he passed, had been in the early stages of a conversation with the legendary philanthropist, Alistair Sterling. Sterling, a man who built and funded entire cultural districts, was looking for an architect for his legacy project, a world-class center for arts and innovation. He wasn't looking for a corporate giant. He was looking for a visionary. He was looking for an artist. Arthur had told him, "I am too old for this mountain, but my partner Julian, he was born to climb it." For the past 3 years, while his family-in-law mocked his little projects, Julian had been meeting secretly with Sterling. While Clara lamented his lack of a corner office, he had been commanding a team of hundreds of engineers, designers, and artisans from a discreet, unmarked office downtown. While Marcus bragged about his condos, Julian had been quietly, methodically, and brilliantly designing the most significant cultural landmark the city had seen in a century. He never told Clara. At first, it was because he wanted it to be a surprise. He wanted to walk her through the finished building, to show her the masterpiece he had built, and see the pride return to her eyes. But as her disappointment in him curdled into a quiet contempt, His silence took on a different meaning. It became a shield. His secret work was the one part of his life that her family's judgment couldn't touch, couldn't tarnish. It was his sanctuary. So when she uttered those words, "He peaked at 25," it wasn't just an insult. It was a verdict delivered in complete, blissful ignorance. She was mourning a man who never existed, while dismissing the far greater one standing right in front of her. And in that moment, Julian's desire to win back her approval died. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He would no longer try to show her. He would simply let the truth reveal itself, and he would let the consequences fall where they may. The spring charity auction at the Oak Ridge Country Club was the apex of the social season for Clara's family. It was an arena where their status was put on full display, a performance of casual wealth and inherited influence. For Julian, it was an annual ordeal. This year, it felt different. The dinner party had been 3 weeks prior, and since then, a quiet, unbreakable tension had settled into his home. Clara was alternating between frosty silence and bouts of frustrated anger. She was furious at his lack of reaction to her comment, interpreting his calm as proof of his apathy. "Are you even listening to me, Julian?" she had demanded 2 nights before the auction. "My father's firm is sponsoring a table. We have to be there. You have to at least try to look like you belong." "I'll be there, Clara," he had said, his voice measured. He was looking over a detailed schematic of a cantilevered viewing platform, the math a soothing balm against the chaos of his marriage. "And for God's sake, don't wear that awful tweed jacket," she added, her voice sharp with disdain. "Can't you just once wear something that doesn't scream, 'struggling academic'?" He didn't tell her that the awful tweed jacket had been a gift from Arthur Vance. He simply nodded. At the club, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and self-congratulation. Marcus was in his element, moving through the crowd with the predatory grace of a shark. He clapped Julian on the shoulder, his grip a little too firm, a gesture of dominance disguised as camaraderie. "Julian, good to see you, buddy," Marcus boomed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Taking a night off from designing bird baths?" A few people chuckled. Julian gave a small, unbothered smile. "Something like that." Clara, standing beside him, flushed a deep crimson. She shot Julian a look of pure venom, as if this were his fault. Later, as the auction began, the real performance started. Richard bid ostentatiously on a week-long yacht trip, then on a case of wine with a famous vintage, his paddle shooting up with practiced nonchalance. It wasn't about the items. It was about demonstrating that the cost was irrelevant. Then Marcus took the stage. He had donated a consultation package from his development company. "For anyone looking to get into the property game," he said into the microphone, his smile blindingly white, "I'm offering a one-on-one mentorship. I'll show you how to turn dirt into gold." The package sold for an obscene amount of money to a fawning admirer. As Marcus walked back to their table, basking in the applause, he paused by Julian's chair. He leaned in close, his voice a conspiratorial whisper laced with condescension. "You know, Julian," he began, "I feel bad. We give you a hard time, but maybe you just need a hand up. I've got a new project starting downtown, the Elysian Towers. Biggest thing I've ever done. I need someone to handle the CAD work for the parking garage ventilation systems. It's not glamorous, but it's steady, a real paycheck. What do you say?" It was an offer wrapped in an insult, a piece of charity designed to put Julian firmly in his place. A low-level draftsman in Marcus's world of high-stakes development. It was a chance for Marcus to finally, formally, absorb Julian into his orbit as a subordinate. Clara held her breath, her eyes pleading with Julian. "Just say yes," her expression screamed. "Just take the lifeline." "For me." Julian looked from Marcus's smug face to his wife's desperate one. He thought of the building he was actually creating downtown, a structure so complex and beautiful, it would make the Elysian Towers look like a child's block castle. The dramatic irony was so thick he could almost taste it. He met Marcus's gaze. "That's a very generous offer, Marcus," he said, his voice polite, almost gentle. "But I'm afraid I have to decline. I'm not really looking for that kind of work right now." Marcus's smile faltered. He had expected gratitude, perhaps even a bit of fumbling deference. He had not expected a calm, simple refusal. "Not looking for work?" he repeated, bewildered. "What, is the library paying that well?" "My current project is just rather demanding," Julian replied smoothly. "It takes up all of my time." Marcus stared at him for a moment, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. He shook his head as if dealing with a child. "You're lost, buddy. The offer's on the table if you ever decide to join the real world." He patted Julian's shoulder again, this time with a pitying finality, and swaggered back to his seat. The rest of the table fell into an awkward silence. Clara wouldn't look at him. Her jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped in her cheek. The humiliation she felt was no longer just about his perceived failure. It was now about his refusal to be saved. He had publicly rejected her brother's patronage, and in her world, that was an unforgivable sin. Later, as they drove home in a silence more violent than any argument, Clara finally spoke, her voice shaking with a rage she could no longer contain. "How could you?" she whispered. "How could you embarrass me like that? By politely declining a job I don't want?" "A job? Julian, that was an olive branch. That was my brother trying to help you, trying to help us, and you threw it back in his face, in front of everyone. Do you have any idea how that looked?" "How did it look, Clara?" he asked, his voice still quiet. "It looked like you're arrogant, like you think you're too good for his help. You with your tiny little firm and your awards that don't pay the bills. You're too good for a real job? It's pathetic." He didn't respond, he just kept driving. Pathetic. The word hung in the air between them. He thought about the call he had to make when he got home, a video conference with the lead engineers in Tokyo and the lighting design team in Stockholm. They were finalizing the kinetic facade of the Sterling Center, a feature so revolutionary it would be studied by architects for decades. A pathetic man's work. When they got home, Clara went straight to the guest room and slammed the door. The sound echoed the finality he had felt at the dinner table. Julian walked into his home office. He sat at his desk and looked at the picture of him and Clara on their wedding day, a relic from a different civilization. He picked it up, looked at it for a long moment, and then gently placed it face down in a drawer. He opened his laptop and joined the video call. On the screen, faces from around the world greeted him with respect. "Julian," said the lead engineer from Tokyo, a man with 50 years of experience, "we have the simulation results for the western facade's wind load. It's performing even better than we hoped. Your design it's flawless." Julian felt a wave of calm wash over him. He was in the real world now, his real world, and soon everyone else would be paying it a visit. The following month was a study in contrasts. At home, Julian lived in a cold war of silent breakfasts and empty spaces in his bed. Clara treated him with a chilling politeness, the kind one reserves for a stranger you are forced to tolerate. Her family had closed ranks, their calls and texts to her increasing, while their acknowledgement of him ceased entirely. He was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost in his own life. But outside that house, Julian was more alive than ever. His secret life, the one he lived in the world of blueprints and steel, had reached its crescendo. The Sterling Center for Arts and Innovation was no longer a theoretical marvel on a computer screen. It was a breathtaking reality rising from the heart of the city. One crisp Tuesday morning, Julian stood on the unfinished rooftop of the main tower, a full 60 stories above the ground. The wind whipped at his coat, but he felt anchored, solid. Beside him stood Alistair Sterling himself. Sterling was in his late 70s, a man whose quiet demeanor belied the immense power he wielded. He wasn't just a developer, he was a city shaper, and this project was the crown jewel of his life's work. Arthur would have loved this, Sterling said, his voice raspy, his gaze sweeping across the panoramic view. He didn't need to shout over the wind. His words had their own gravity. He always said a building should have a soul. You've given this one a magnificent one, Julian. Julian looked down at the city sprawling below. He could see Marcus's Elysian towers, half-finished, looking squat and uninspired from this vantage point. He could see the rooftop of the country club where he had been patronized, the bank where his father-in-law reigned, the entire geography of his humiliation laid out like a map. And rising above it all was this, his creation. The building was an architectural masterpiece. It wasn't a single tower but a campus, a collection of interlocking structures that flowed into one another like a piece of music. The main concert hall was acoustically perfect, wrapped in a skin of shimmering, responsive panels that adjusted to the light. The art galleries were vast, skylit spaces that seemed to float. The innovation labs were hives of collaborative energy, and connecting it all was a soaring public atrium, a grand, light-filled space that would serve as the city's new living room. It was the antithesis of everything Marcus built. It was a place for people, not for profit. It was designed for legacy, not for a quick return on investment. The kinetic facade is fully operational as of this morning, Julian said, pointing to the western face of the building. As he spoke, the thousands of metallic panels on the building's skin began to shift in a slow, undulating wave, catching the morning sun and sending ripples of light across the city. It looked as if the building was breathing. Sterling watched, a rare, broad smile spreading across his face. "My God, Julian, it's alive." "That was the idea," Julian said quietly. They spent an hour walking the site, Sterling asking detailed questions, Julian answering with the effortless command of a man who knew every bolt, every weld, every pane of glass in the entire complex. There was a deep and abiding respect between the two men, the easy rapport of collaborators who shared a vision. As they rode the construction elevator back down, Sterling turned to him. "The opening gala is in 6 weeks. The press is already calling it the most important architectural opening of the decade. They're all clamoring to know who the mystery architect is. We've kept your name under wraps as you requested. Are you ready for the curtain to be pulled back?" Julian thought of Clara's words. He peaked at 25. He thought of Marcus's offer to design a parking garage. He thought of Richard's dismissive glances. "I think it's time," Julian said. "Good," Sterling nodded, "because I plan to give you the introduction you deserve." That evening, Julian was home, sketching in his notebook at the kitchen island, when Clara walked in. She had a magazine in her hand, and she threw it down in front of him. It was a major city lifestyle publication. The cover story was a breathless preview of the Sterling Center. "Have you seen this?" she asked, her voice tight. "It's all anyone is talking about. Alistair Sterling's masterpiece. They say it's going to completely change the city." Julian looked at the glossy photos of the building's soaring atrium and shimmering facade. His building. "I've heard about it," he said, his voice neutral. "Heard about it?" Clara laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Of course you have. God, can you imagine building something like that? Something that matters? The architect is anonymous. They're saying it's probably some world-famous Pritzker Prize winner they flew in. A starchitect." She said the word with a mixture of awe and envy. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a familiar, weary disappointment. "That's the kind of thing I once thought you would do." Julian met her gaze. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching a scene from a play where he already knew the ending. He could tell her right now. He could slide the key, the master key to the entire Sterling Center complex that he now carried with him always, across the island and end the charade. But he didn't. The time wasn't right. The revelation needed a stage. Not this quiet, sterile kitchen, but a place full of the people who had judged him. He wanted them to see. He needed them to see. "It is an impressive building," was all he said. Clara shook her head, a gesture of finality. It's more than impressive, Julian. It's a legacy, something that will be there 100 years from now. She picked up the magazine and walked away, leaving him alone with his sketches and his secret. He looked down at the page. He was no longer sketching buildings. He was drawing a detailed rendering of the single steel key he carried in his pocket. A key to his future. A key that would soon lock the door on his past. The weeks leading up to the Sterling Center Gala were the quietest, most tense period of Julian and Clara's marriage. They moved around each other like ghosts, the space between them filled with unspoken resentments. For Julian, it was the deep, quietening calm before a storm he had long seen coming. For Clara, it was the bewildering final act of a slow, painful disillusionment. She had given up trying to understand him, resigning herself to the fact that her husband was a man who lived his life in the minor keys, content with a world she found suffocatingly small. The conflict reached a new, painful peak over a simple vacation. Clara's parents had invited them on a 2-week trip to Tuscany, staying in a lavish villa they had rented for the month. It was a command performance, and Clara was desperate to go. "Everyone will be there," she said, her voice brittle. "My cousins from London, the DuPonts. It's important, Julian." "I can't, Clara," he said, not looking up from his laptop. "I have a major deadline. It's the most critical phase of the project." "Project? What project?" she scoffed, her frustration boiling over. "The community garden shed? The new benches for the park? Julian, for once in your life, can you please prioritize us?" "Prioritize me? My parents are paying for everything. All you have to do is show up and pretend to be part of this family for 2 weeks. Is that too much to ask?" The cruelty of her words struck him, but his expression remained unchanged. "I can't go," he repeated, his voice flat. "It's impossible." "Impossible," she repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. "Nothing is impossible when you want it, Julian. You just don't want this. You don't want my life. You don't want my family. Maybe," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "you don't want me." He finally looked up from his screen. He saw the genuine pain in her eyes, the desperate plea for him to be someone he was not. And for a fleeting moment, he felt a pang of the old love he once had for her, a sorrow for what they had lost. But it was like feeling a phantom limb. The connection was no longer there. "Clara," he said, and his voice was softer now. "This deadline, it's the most important one of my life. In a few weeks, you'll understand." "Oh, I understand now," she said, turning her back to him. "I understand perfectly." She went to Tuscany without him. The pictures she posted on social media were a performance of forced joy. Clara raising a glass of Prosecco with Marcus. Clara laughing with her mother by an infinity pool. Clara posing with a group of friends, a radiant smile on her face that never reached her eyes. In every photo there was a conspicuous, husband-shaped hole beside her. Her friends and family filled the comments with sympathetic notes. "You're better off without him dragging you down," one wrote. "Living your best life," wrote another. Julian saw the posts. He felt nothing. He was working 18-hour days, sleeping on a cot in his on-site office at the Sterling Center, fueled by coffee and a relentless drive for perfection. He was coordinating the final installations, overseeing the lighting tests, walking every square inch of the complex to ensure it was flawless. He was a general in the final hours before a decisive victory. The petty skirmishes of his domestic life felt a world away. The invitation to the Sterling Center inaugural gala arrived a week before the event. It was a thick, cream-colored card, engraved with a simple, elegant rendering of the center's silhouette. It was the most coveted invitation in the city. Julian found it on the hall table when he came home one night to pick up a change of clothes. Clara was back from Italy, her tan a stark contrast to the coldness in her eyes. She was holding an identical invitation. "Marcus's company managed to get a table," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He said we have to go. It's the event of the year. Everyone who is anyone will be there." She looked at him, a challenge in her gaze. I assume you have another project that will keep you from attending. Julian picked up his invitation. His name was printed in crisp, black ink. Mr. Julian Croft. No, he said, meeting her eyes. I'll go. Her surprise was palpable. You will? Yes, he said. I think it's important that I'm there. A flicker of something, hope, relief, crossed her face before it was replaced by suspicion. Why? So you can stand in a corner and critique the architecture? Something like that, he said, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. He slipped the invitation into his jacket pocket, next to the steel key. The night of the gala, Julian prepared with a deliberate, almost ceremonial care. He bypassed the suits Clara had always criticized, the ones she deemed too academic or not expensive enough. Instead, he took out a garment bag that had been hanging untouched in the back of his closet for months. Inside was a suit he had had custom made by a tailor in London during a secret trip for the project. It was a deep charcoal gray, exquisitely cut, the kind of suit whose quality was apparent, not in flashy labels, but in its perfect drape and flawless construction. It was a suit that spoke of quiet confidence and unstated power. When he came downstairs, Clara was waiting, dressed in a shimmering silver gown. She looked beautiful, but her face was a mask of anxiety. She looked him up and down, and her mouth fell slightly open. She had never seen him in clothes like these. He looked different, taller, more substantial. Is that new? She asked, a note of confusion in her voice. It's for a special occasion, he said simply. He held out his arm for her. Hesitantly, she took it. The drive to the gala was silent, but this silence was different. It was not the angry, resentful silence of their recent past. It was a silence filled with anticipation, a palpable hum in the air, the quiet before the storm. Julian was perfectly calm. He rested one hand on the steering wheel, the other in his pocket, his fingers wrapped around the cool, heavy steel of the key. He was no longer a defendant on his way to be judged. He was an architect, on his way to unveil his masterpiece. The Sterling Center was a vision, bathed in a soft, ethereal glow, its kinetic facade sending slow, gentle waves of light across the night sky. It looked less like a building and more like a celestial object that had chosen to grace the city with its presence. Valets in crisp uniforms scurried to open car doors as a river of guests, the city's wealthiest, most powerful, and most influential, flowed up the grand staircase and into the soaring atrium. The inside was even more breathtaking. The scale of the space was cathedral-like, yet it felt intimate and welcoming. A string orchestra played from a balcony, their music echoing in the acoustically perfect hall. Waiters moved silently through the crowd with trays of champagne and impossibly delicate hors d'oeuvres. The air buzzed with energy, with awe. Clara, for her part, was utterly mesmerized. She craned her neck, her eyes wide, taking in the soaring glass ceiling, the floating walkways, the sheer, audacious beauty of it all. My God, Julian, she breathed, her earlier anxieties momentarily forgotten. It's perfect. Julian looked around the space he had lived and breathed for 3 years. He saw not just the finished product, but the thousands of sketches, the endless meetings, the sleepless nights that had gone into every detail. I'm glad you like it, he said. They found their table, sponsored by Marcus's development company. Richard and Eleanor were already there, along with Marcus and his wife. Marcus was holding court, trying to project an air of belonging. But even he seemed slightly intimidated by the sheer class of the event. Compared to the Sterling Center, his own luxury condo developments suddenly felt cheap, ostentatious. Can you believe this place? Marcus said, shaking his head as Julian and Clara sat down. He gestured vaguely at the soaring architecture. Sterling must have spent $1 billion, hired some European starchitect, I heard, probably paid him a fortune. Richard nodded, his expression a mixture of envy and grudging respect. This is legacy. This is real power, Not like that flimsy glass box you're putting up, Marcus. Marcus flushed, wounded by his father's casual dismissal. The Elysian is 80% pre-sold, Dad, he said defensively. Their bickering was a familiar noise, but tonight Julian heard it as if from a great distance. He was serene, an island of calm in his family's turbulent sea of status anxiety. He sipped his water, his eyes scanning the room. He saw journalists from international papers, critics from the world's most respected architectural journals, politicians, artists, and titans of industry. And then he saw Alistair Sterling, moving slowly through the room, greeting his guests. Their eyes met across the crowded hall. Sterling gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Julian returned it. The signal was sent. The overture was ending. The main performance was about to begin. Clara, oblivious, was trying to engage him in the family's favorite pastime, judgment. "It's a bit much, isn't it?" she whispered to him, trying to find a crack in the perfection, a way to reassert her own taste. "A little self-important? Do you think so?" Julian asked, his voice genuinely curious. "Well, yes. I mean, who needs a space this big? It's pure ego." Before Julian could respond, Marcus leaned across the table. "Look who's here, Julian," he said with a smirk. "Maybe you can get his autograph." He pointed toward a man holding court near the orchestra balcony. It was Daniel Libeskind, the actual world-famous architect. "Go on, don't be shy. Tell him you're in the business too. Maybe he needs someone to design his parking garages." The joke, a callback to his insulting offer at the country club, was met with a weak titter from his wife. Richard grunted in amusement. Clara winced, her embarrassment for Julian so acute it was almost a physical pain. Julian simply looked at Marcus and gave him a small, enigmatic smile. "I don't think I'll need to do that," he said. The lights in the atrium began to dim, and a hush fell over the crowd. A spotlight found the stage at the far end of the hall. Alistair Sterling, looking frail but radiating an undeniable authority, walked to the podium. The applause was thunderous. "Welcome," Sterling began, his voice amplified throughout the vast space. "Welcome to a dream of a city that values beauty as much as commerce, that values community as much as capital, that values the human soul." He spoke for several minutes about his vision, about his love for the city. Julian watched his family. They were enthralled, hanging on every word from this titan of industry. They looked like supplicants in the court of a king. "A project of this magnitude," Sterling continued, "is not the work of one man. It is the work of thousands. But at its heart, it requires a single, unifying vision. It requires an artist of profound talent, unwavering integrity, and relentless dedication. For 3 years, we have kept the identity of this artist, the chief architect of the Sterling Center, a closely guarded secret. We did this at his request. He is a man who does not seek the spotlight. He seeks only to create things of meaning and beauty." At his table, Marcus leaned over to Clara. "God, the drama," he whispered. "Just tell us who it is already." Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on the stage. Sterling paused, letting the anticipation build to an almost unbearable level. "There are architects who build for ego," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "They give us towers of glass and steel that are monuments to nothing but the wealth of their owners. They are loud, but they say nothing." Julian could feel Marcus shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "And then," Sterling's voice grew stronger, "there are architects who build for humanity. They give us spaces that lift the spirit, that foster connection, that remind us of our better selves. They are quiet, but their work speaks volumes. The architect of this center is one of those. He is a visionary. He is a poet of structure and light, and he is a man I am now deeply proud to call my friend." Sterling looked out over the crowd, his eyes searching. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to introduce you to the heart and soul of the Sterling Center. The man who turned this dream into a breathtaking reality, Mr. Julian Croft." The name dropped into the silent hall like a stone into a perfectly still pond. For a moment there was nothing, just a collective, silent processing of an impossible piece of information. Julian felt 1,000 pairs of eyes swiveling towards his table. He saw the confusion, the disbelief. At his own table, the reaction was apocalyptic. Marcus's jaw had literally dropped open, his face a mask of slack-jawed incredulity. Richard's face went pale, then a blotchy red. He looked from the stage to Julian and back again, as if his brain was refusing to connect the two. Eleanor had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. And Clara's face was a canvas of utter, soul-shattering devastation. All the color drained from it. Her eyes, fixed on Julian, were filled with a dawning horror that was almost painful to watch. It was the look of a person who realizes they have made a terrible, irreversible, life-altering mistake. The man she had dismissed, mocked, and pitied. The man who had peaked at 25. The man she had accused of designing bus shelters and garden sheds. That man was the anonymous genius they had all been breathlessly discussing for months. A single spotlight detached from the stage and moved through the darkness, slowly, deliberately, until it found Julian, bathing him in a brilliant white light. The silence broke. A ripple of applause started at the front of the room, then grew, swelling into a deafening, rolling wave of appreciation. A standing ovation. Julian stood up. He looked calm, composed. He glanced at his family, at their shattered expressions, but his gaze lingered on Clara. He saw it all in her eyes. The shame, the regret, the sudden, horrifying understanding of just how blind she had been. He turned and began to walk towards the stage, towards Alistair Sterling, towards the light. He was no longer a ghost in his own life. He was the architect of its most magnificent structure, and everyone was finally seeing it. The walk to the stage felt both instantaneous and eternal. The roar of the applause was a physical force, yet Julian felt a profound sense of quiet inside himself. He was aware of the faces he passed, faces of awe, respect, and stunned surprise. He was most aware of the faces he had left behind at the table, frozen in their tableau of shock. When he reached the podium, Alistair Sterling shook his hand firmly, his eyes twinkling. "The stage is yours, Julian," he said, his voice low enough for only him to hear. "You've earned it." Julian stepped up to the microphone. The applause slowly subsided, replaced by an expectant hush. He looked out at the sea of faces, 1,000 points of light in the cavernous hall. He wasn't nervous. He had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, not by practicing a speech, but by pouring his soul into the very walls that surrounded them. "Thank you, Alistair," he began, his voice clear and steady, amplified to fill every corner of the atrium. "Thank you all. A building like this is not born from one person. It is born from a shared belief. A belief that our public spaces should be as ambitious as our private ones. That beauty is a public right, not a private luxury." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet authority in his tone commanded attention. He spoke about his mentor, Arthur Vance, and his philosophy of building for people. He spoke about the collaborative effort of the engineers, the artisans, the construction workers. He spoke with a humility that made his achievement seem even greater. He never once looked at his family. He didn't need to. He could feel their gaze on him, a burning, desperate focus. "Architecture, at its best," he continued, "is a form of storytelling. It tells the story of who we are and who we aspire to be. This building is a story of connection, of innovation, and of hope. It was the honor of my life to help write it." He kept his remarks brief, elegant, and powerful. When he finished, the hall erupted again, the applause even more fervent than before. As he walked off the stage, he was immediately engulfed. The mayor of the city was the first to shake his hand, followed by a throng of cultural and business leaders. The very people who wouldn't have given him a second glance an hour earlier were now pressing their business cards into his hand, their voices a chorus of praise and congratulations. He moved through the crowd with grace, accepting the accolades with a calm dignity. From across the room, he could see his family. They were an island of paralysis in a sea of celebration. No one was approaching their table. It was as if a force field of shame surrounded them. Marcus was staring at his water glass as if it held the secrets of the universe. Richard was alternately looking at Julian and his son, his face a thundercloud of fury and confusion. And Clara was just watching him. Her expression was stripped bare of all its social armor. All that was left was a raw, gaping wound of regret. She watched as he was embraced by the city's elite, as he spoke with the world-renowned critic who had once been her idol, as he moved with an ease and confidence she had never seen in him. She was watching a stranger she had been married to for 10 years. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She rose from the table, her movements stiff, and began to make her way toward him through the dense crowd. It was like swimming against a powerful current. When she finally reached him, he was in conversation with a senator. He excused himself politely and turned to face her. "Julian," she began, her voice a choked whisper. The roar of the room seemed to fade away, leaving them in a strange, isolated bubble of silence. "Julian, She couldn't find the words. What could she say? "I'm sorry I thought you were a failure. I'm sorry I publicly humiliated you. I'm sorry I had no idea who you were." "I didn't know," she finally managed, the words pathetic and small. Julian looked at her. His face was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was simply calm, with a deep, unshakable sadness at its core. It was the face of a man who had already grieved and moved on. "No," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the din. "You didn't." He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to list her transgressions. In that moment, she heard them all. She heard, "He peaked at 25, echoing in the magnificent hall he had built at 35. She heard her own mocking words about his charming little projects. She saw her brother's insulting job offer, her father's dismissive scorn, her own crushing disappointment. It all came rushing back at her, not as memories, but as indictments. "Why didn't you tell me?" she pleaded, her eyes welling with tears. Why did you let us say those things?" "Would you have believed me?" he asked, the question gentle but devastatingly sharp. "If I had told you I was building this, would you have believed me? Or would you have called it another one of my foolish dreams?" She had no answer. Because they both knew the truth. She would not have believed him. She would have seen it as another delusion, another excuse for his failure to live up to her family's narrow definition of success. "I stood by you," he continued, his voice still low, measured, but each word landing with the weight of a hammer blow. "I stood by you through a decade of quiet cuts and public humiliations, at your father's dinner table, at the country club, in our own home. I absorbed the disappointment of you, your parents, your brother. I never once dishonored you. I just kept working." He paused, and his gaze drifted for a moment to the soaring ceiling of the atrium, his atrium. "This," he said, gesturing to the space around them, "this was my sanctuary. This was the place where your family's judgment couldn't reach. I didn't keep it from you to punish you, Clara. I kept it from you to protect it, to protect the last part of myself that you hadn't tried to break." A tear finally escaped and traced a path through her makeup. "Julian, please," she whispered. "We can fix this. I see now. I was wrong. I was so wrong." He looked back at her, and for the first time he saw the full extent of the chasm that had opened between them. It was not a crack that could be spackled over. It was a canyon, vast and uncrossable. "The foundation is broken, Clara," he said, using the language of his own craft. "The damage is structural. You can't just repaint the walls and pretend the building is sound." He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around the cool steel of the key. He didn't take it out. He didn't need the theatrics. The decision was already made. "I love you," she said, the words a desperate, last-ditch effort to save a world that was already gone. Julian gave a sad, small smile. "You love the idea of who I was at 25, he corrected her gently, "and you were ashamed of the man you thought I was at 35. But you never, not once, tried to see the man I actually am." He held her gaze for a moment longer. There was no hatred in his eyes. There was only a profound and final sense of release. "Goodbye, Clara," he said, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd of admirers, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the magnificent hall her husband had built, a stranger in the ruins of her own life. The days that followed the gala were a blur of seismic shifts. Julian's life, once quiet and private, was now spectacularly public. His face was on the cover of magazines, his name in the headlines of newspapers around the world. The mystery architect was a mystery no more, and the story was irresistible. The quiet genius, hiding in plain sight, who had created a modern masterpiece. He was inundated with offers, requests for interviews, invitations to speak at universities. He handled it all with the same calm grace he had displayed on stage. For Clara and her family, the aftermath was a private apocalypse. Their social currency, built on a foundation of wealth and smug superiority, had been devalued overnight. They had been exposed, not for a lack of money, but for a profound lack of perception. They had been sitting on a winning lottery ticket for 10 years and had not only failed to cash it, but had actively tried to throw it away. Clara's attempts to contact Julian were frantic, then desperate, then heartbreakingly futile. She called, she texted, she sent long, rambling emails filled with apologies, recriminations, and pleas for a second chance. "Julian, please call me. We need to talk. I can't sleep. I can't eat. All I can see is your face when he called your name. How could I have been so blind? My father is furious, not at you, at me, at all of us. He said we had a Pritzker winner in the family and we treated him like the help. I went to the library you designed, the one in West End. I just sat there for hours. It's beautiful. The light. It's just like the Sterling Center. It was there all along, wasn't it? I just refused to see it." Julian read the messages, but he did not reply. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of self-preservation. He had closed a door, and he knew that to open it again, even a crack, would be to invite back the old pain, the old judgment. The fallout for Marcus was even more immediate and brutal. His flagship project, the Elysian Towers, once a symbol of his success, was now a public punchline. In the radiant glow of the Sterling Center, his building looked exactly like what it was, a soulless, profit-driven box. A prominent architecture critic, in a glowing review of Julian's work, dedicated a savage paragraph to the Elysian, calling it a monument to vapid greed and the architectural equivalent of a cheap suit. Investors grew nervous. Sales stalled. The project and Marcus's reputation began to crumble. Richard, the patriarch, retreated into a stony, furious silence. His power had always been absolute within his own domain, but Julian's success was something he couldn't control, couldn't buy, and couldn't intimidate. He had misjudged Julian so completely, so catastrophically, that it called his own legendary business acumen into question. He had failed the most important due diligence of his life. About 2 weeks after the gala, Julian was in his new office on the 58th floor of the Sterling Center, a minimalist space with a single, panoramic window overlooking the city he had reshaped. His lawyer was with him, and they were finalizing the paperwork. The divorce was uncontested. Julian was asking for nothing from Clara, and he was giving her the house, the car, everything they had shared. He wanted only to sever the connection, cleanly and completely. As his lawyer packed his briefcase, he paused. "You know," he said, "in 20 years of doing this, I've never seen a reversal of fortune this poetic." Julian looked out the window. "It's not fortune," he said quietly. "It's just cause and effect." He had moved out of the house the day after the gala. He had packed a single bag and had left his old life behind. He had also left a single object on the kitchen island where Clara had once thrown down the magazine. It was the heavy, custom-milled steel key, the master key to the Sterling Center. It was a final, silent statement. "This is the world I was building while you were looking the other way. This is the key to the kingdom you never knew existed." He knew she would understand its symbolism. His new life was taking shape. Alistair Sterling had made him a full partner in his foundation, tasking him with overseeing all of its future architectural and cultural projects. He was not just an architect for hire anymore. He was a patron, a shaper of the future on a global scale. One afternoon, a woman came to his office. Her name was Dr. Eris Thorne, a renowned art historian and the newly appointed chief curator for the Sterling Center's galleries. She was sharp, brilliant, with eyes that seemed to see not just what was there, but the history and meaning behind it. She wasn't there to flatter him. She was there to challenge him. "Your atrium is a masterpiece of public space," she said, foregoing any preamble. "But a gallery is different. It's a conversation between the art and the viewer. How does your design facilitate that conversation without shouting over it?" They talked for 2 hours. They argued about sightlines, about the quality of light, about the philosophy of art in space. Julian felt an intellectual spark he hadn't felt in years. She saw his work, truly saw it, and engaged with it on the level he had always craved. She wasn't impressed by his fame. She was engaged by his mind. At the end of their meeting, as she was leaving, she paused at the door. "You know," she said, "for years I've been using the West End Library as an example in my lectures on modern civic architecture. I never knew who designed it. It makes sense now." She smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "It's good to finally meet the artist behind the work." In that simple acknowledgement, Julian felt a sense of rightness, of peace, that 1,000 standing ovations could never provide. She saw the through line, the consistent philosophy that connected the small, humble library to the grand, celebrated cultural center. She saw him. Months later, the divorce was final. The Sterling Center was a thriving, beloved hub of city life. Marcus's company was facing bankruptcy. Richard and Eleanor had retreated from the social scene. Their reign quietly ended. And Clara had sold the house. Julian heard through a mutual acquaintance that she had moved to a small apartment downtown and had gone back to school to finish her PhD in art history, the degree she had abandoned 10 years earlier. The acquaintance said she seemed quieter, more thoughtful, as if she were trying to rebuild herself from the ground up. Julian felt a distant pang of sadness for her, but no regret. Her journey was her own now. One evening, Julian stood on the public observation deck of the Sterling Center, the one he had first shown Alistair Sterling all those months ago. The city lights twinkled below, a galaxy of human endeavor. He was no longer looking down on the map of his old life. He was looking out at a future of his own design. He thought about success. For so long, he had been judged by a version of it that equated to noise, to size, to wealth. But he had learned that true worth wasn't about the height of the buildings you construct, but the strength of the foundations you lay. It wasn't about being loud. It was about having something meaningful to say. He had been a quiet man, but he had built a legacy that would speak for him for generations. He had not peaked at 25. He had not even peaked at 35. He was just getting started. The architect was finally home, in a house of his own making, a house built of integrity, purpose, and a quiet, unshakable sense of self. And the view was magnificent. What an incredible journey of patience, integrity, and ultimate vindication. Julian's story is a powerful reminder that true success isn't always loud and flashy. Sometimes it's built quietly, with dedication and purpose, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. It teaches us that our worth is not determined by the judgment of others, but by the integrity of our own work and the strength of our own character. What does true success mean to you? Have you ever felt underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? We would love to read your stories and your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences give these stories so much more meaning. If you were moved by Julian's story and the lessons it holds, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of redemption, justice, and the quiet power of the human spirit. Thank you for being here with us today, and we'll see you in the next story.